10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 367. Hey everybody, welcome into episode 367 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. So happy to have you back, and if you're new to the show, welcome in. This week we are continuing our series on intervals, and we are going to jump into some combinations of intervals, which again is just going to open up the absolute world to you in terms of working on this stuff and being able to practice intervals in new and inventive ways that are going to provide you with a ton of flexibility when it comes to soloing. After all, as I always say, a melody is nothing but a combination of different intervals, and that's kind of what we're going for when we study this stuff. So before we jump into the show, as always, wanted to mention this is a listener-supported podcast, which means that we rely on people just like you to keep the show coming out, to keep things rolling, and we do that in the form of a small monthly donation. We use the Patreon platform for that, and you do get a PDF and audio examples and all sorts of really cool stuff with every single episode in return for that small monthly donation. As I mentioned, we use the Patreon platform, so if you are interested in signing up to support the show and receive a bunch of jazz education materials in return, this episode, along with every single episode that we've ever done, lives on that site over there. You can go to 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or you can simply go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. And we really appreciate everybody over there that's part of the family, everybody that's been supporting this show for weeks, months, and years. We could not do this without you. So again, patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. All right, let's jump in. So I wanted to do a quick disclaimer before we get into this stuff. I showed you a lot of things last week, and it may have seemed like, oh, well, it was just a little 10-minute lesson, but you could work on that stuff that I gave you last week for a couple of years, right, to really master it. So although you're going to hear me talking about a completely different concept with intervals this week, what you may want to do, if this stuff is new to you, is file this away in a notebook somewhere or a binder or something like that on your computer, and just look at it as future work. If you can't do some of the stuff that I showed you last week, don't necessarily try to move on to this stuff right away. Just sit and listen to this podcast and see it as a thing to come in your practice time. All right. Don't feel pressure to work on this right away. That's just really, really important. I understand that I put out a lot of information, and it's one of the qualms I actually have with this format of what I'm doing here, is I go through a lot of stuff really quickly, and you've got to understand that it's not meant for you to work on this 1 week after I showed you what I showed you last week. All right. So a lot of this stuff is meant to just like mentally catalog and physically catalog as something that you can come back to once you have some of the other things mastered and down pat. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is what I like to call interval combinations. So it's taking two intervals and putting them together into a completely different exercise than happens when you just work on one interval at a time. And I understand that can sound really confusing until we actually get into it. So let's actually get into it and figure out what I'm talking about. So last week we talked about taking one interval and trying to figure out a bunch of different directions that we could play that interval. And that's going to give you a lot of flexibility with one interval at a time. So for instance, we talked about thirds and we talked about fifths on last week's episode. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a combination of some of these diatonic intervals, and we're going to put them together to create exercises. So I want you to pull out your PDF. It would be tremendously helpful if you have something to look at when we go over some of these exercises this week, okay? So let's look at the first exercise. The first exercise involves taking the interval of a second and combining it with the interval of a fourth. Okay, so let's break this down and see if we can make it easily understandable. So if you look at exercise number 1, what we start with is we start on concert C and we play the interval of a second. So that would be C to D. So think about that C to D as a unit, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to jump up to F and we're going to play F to G, which is another interval of a second. So now what we have is we have these two units, C to D and F to G. Those are 2 units of a second. But what separates those 2 units is the interval of a fourth. So now think about the starting note of each one of those units. We start one of the units on C, and we start the next unit on F. And the distance between those 2 notes is a fourth. So we have 2 units of seconds, but they are a fourth apart. Hopefully that makes sense to you. It's a little bit of a mental leap, but that's what all these exercises are going to be based off of this week. So then we move those units of seconds a fourth apart up the C major scale. So again, we're doing this diatonically, right? So the first unit would be C, D, F, G. The second unit would be D, E, G, A. So let's look at those 2 units. The first unit is D to E, a second. The second unit is G to A, a second. But D and G are a fourth apart. 2 units of seconds, a fourth apart. And then we just keep moving that pattern up the scale. And so on and so forth until we get to a logical stopping point. And the thing about diatonic is the seconds change. Sometimes they're major seconds, sometimes they're minor seconds. It all depends on the scale, all right? So let's hear what that entire exercise sounds like all together. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense because that's going to be the basis of everything that we're going to do. Let's dive into another one, like really in depth here, just to make sure that we totally understand it. So the second exercise on your PDF for this week is going to be a third moving in fourths. So again, we have 2 units, but now these units are made up of a third. So we have C to E, and then the second unit is going to be F to A. And again, the overall relationship between the 2 units is that of a fourth. One starts on C and one starts on F. Okay? So this one is going to sound like this, very, very different. And you see how just combining 2 different intervals, the first one was a second and a fourth. Now we have a third and a fourth, and we have a completely different sounding exercise. Let's check out what this one sounds like. So you could hear really, really interesting. All we did was we changed that first interval, right, to a third instead of a second. And we're still moving that unit in fourths, which is pretty cool. So what if we now did a third, but we moved it in sixths? So we do C to E as our first unit. And then we jump up a sixth to B, and we do B to D. Completely different sound. Now that's actually way harder because the units are much further apart. And we talked about last week why that can be really, really hard on certain instruments, but it can also really open up your ears. And it can take the interval of a third and completely change the way it feels and sounds when you're playing it. Let's hear what that one sounds like. This is exercise number 3 on your PDF. Thirds moving in sixths. You're starting to hear the power of these groupings moving in different intervals. Let's do one more, and then there are other examples on the sheet this week. That'll be over on Patreon for everybody. Let's do one more. This is going to be the interval of a fourth moving in thirds. So again, if we start on C, one unit is C to F, and then the next unit is going to be E to A. So 2 units of fourths that are a third apart. And the third is where one starts on C and one starts on E. Okay, so and so on and so forth all the way through there. Okay, the actual recording of that one will be over on Patreon for Patreon members, and there's 2 more. But wow, I mean, again, the amount of possibilities here is just absolutely insane. It boggles the mind how much you could do with this with a simple major scale and these combinations of interval units. Okay, you can make them as wide as you want, as narrow as you want. And when you change that first interval, it completely changes everything. And when you change that second interval, it completely changes anything. So the types of like sort of formulas that you could come up with and the amount of possibilities, it's really endless. And it's something as simple as 2 prompts, 2 different intervals. So you could experiment with those as well. And that could really, it could get you years of practice, which I think is just so cool. One simple idea fleshed out amongst all the possibilities is going to provide you with just an endless amount of things to practice. And that's why I always find it so funny when somebody, I don't know what to practice. Well, something like this could take you through literally, like I keep saying, years of practice. And how much would this benefit your flexibility and your ability to solo over anything that was presented to you, your ability to create interesting melodies? This is really where it's at. So let me know if you have any questions. Next week, we're actually going to bring back our Lick of the Month episode. We haven't done that in a while, but I think that would be a really cool way to sort of break up these interval episodes, would be to do our Lick of the Month and then, of course, our Tune of the Month. And I'm going to bring you a pretty interesting one that has a lot to do with intervals by one of the masters of intervals. So you have to tune in next week to find out about that. So remember, you can grab the PDF with all these exercises, audio examples, everything over on our Patreon site, 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners, or simply go to patreon.com and search up the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Either one of those things will get you where you want to go. And thank you to everybody over there that is supporting the show. We could not do this without you. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will see you next week. Bye.